Good morning and welcome to Wanstead, the home of Epping Forest beekeepers. I'd like to thank you for coming on a cold and hopefully not wet day. And I'm just going to introduce to you Stuart Anderson, but to remind ourselves that a good beekeeper is a thinking beekeeper, and often engineers make good beekeepers because they think about problems and they think sideways and they work with nature, which after all is the greatest engineer. I do not trust technology. So we have two men, Stuart Anderson and his son Cedar, who come from New South Wales, and they don't necessarily have an engineering background, but they obviously have a thinking background. And I'm going to hand you over to a revolutionary concept in beekeeping, which some people may think will solve everything, and some people will think will solve nothing. So we're about to find out. Stuart Anderson, thank you very much. A warm welcome.
Thanks very much, Eric. And if you can't hear me, just wave or throw something at me. It is an honour to be here. Thanks very much for coming out on. It is a nippy-ish sort of a day, and but I just appreciate this chance for all of the little discussions and for this. Of course, this will be a talk, but at some point it'll be questions and discuss and sort of turn into beekeeping discussion with more different opinions than there are people here, which I think is just marvellous, So thanks very much. What I'm going to do with this talk is I'm going to sort of use a beehive and describe it as we go, although a lot of you know much more about beehives than I do, and also use it as a sort of a metaphor for the journey that my son Cedar and I went on in inventing the flow frames. So you'll see what I mean if I start that. This is the base of a beehive, and this is a national size and has the mesh bottom that I wasn't used to in Australia. I mean, we're getting used to it now, but we don't have Varroa, but it is useful for the small hive beetle that we have a lot of trouble with. And if you buy a full FlowHive, you get a base like this, slightly different size, with the mesh and a slider in underneath. But it also, if this is disturbing, if this crackles away, we can turn it off. How's the sound going?
All right.
Because you're getting all of that noise there, and there's the hum of the bees. And anyway, the FlowHive needs to tilt, and it needs to tilt. If you look at that hive there, it's tilted forward towards its entrance, and that's in case there's any rain or condensation inside. It'll tend to dribble out the entrance, and I got brought up beekeeping like that as well. The hive's tilted forward, but usually the way we set up the flow frames is for the honey to drain out the back, which means that we need to tilt the hive backwards, which complicates things, but we can talk a bit more about that later. So that's the base of a beehive with a ventilation and so on, and usually there's a piece that can slide in and catch any of the detritus. This is horrible, isn't it? Crackling away.
It's rubbing on your collar, Stu.
Is that what it's doing? Will I take this coat off? I know, if I take the coat off, then no.
Bring it down a bit on the collar. Bring it down a bit.
Bring it down a bit.
You went, don't trip over your shoelaces because it's coming.
There's my shoelaces. I'm really getting in trouble here.
Behind you!
Where was I? Okay,
There you go.
that's better. We're not crackling now. So we can talk some more about this later on as we talk more about beekeeping. But this is also a metaphor for me, as a base, the foundation of how this whole invention and this amazing time with my son and I, happened. And that's because, of my family. I'm just so grateful for the family I live in and am part of. They were so supportive of us as we went through this sort of journey. and not only my family, but the sort of community of the Northern Rivers of New South Wales. And I'm also grateful for, there's a few people in this audience who hopped in early with the crowdfunding and said, yeah, well, we're going to help. We think this is an amazing thing. Because Cedar and I at that stage, and I'll talk about this some more, didn't know what was going to happen. So the foundation is really gratitude for the situation I find myself in, for being able to come and meet people like you, and for the support from so many friends and family, and for our extraordinary world, really. I mean, that's for the miracle of life. So gratitude and as a foundation. So the next bit, as you know, that goes on a beehive is the brood, and this is a national brood. So it's has frames like this that the bees build their brood comb on, and the wax foundation gives them a bit of a start, and so on. And just to go, when we supply the full hive to you, if you decide to get that, or if you've already got that, you get it without this wax foundation. And that was something new for Cedar and me as well, because we were used to, sticking foundation on wires and so on. But most of the stuff we're making now is made in Brisbane in Australia. But at the time we were dealing with an American supplier who said, you have got such a large volume of orders, we cannot source enough foundation wax to supply what you're asking us to supply. It's just not there. And there's also the other problem that some countries won't allow wax in to be imported. It might harbour pests and so on. It shouldn't, but it might. And so they said, how about we go what's called natural? Put a little thin bar along the top of the frame, and if you're lucky, the bees will build their foundation, build their comb and their brood comb. Yeah, this one's falling apart. Straight down from that. So that was also new in terms of beekeeping for me, but we found that generally works, and we've sort of made it even harder for people. This is falling apart. We've made it hard for people to look. I think the foundation really helps the bees do lovely straight combs, so it's easy to lift the brood out and have a look at it. The risk with the so-called natural approaches, the bees do what they do. Some of them will build diagonally across here, and all of a sudden you're in a hell of a mess trying to untangle that so that you can inspect your brood. So we can talk some more about that sort of thing later, but that's the brood box. And for me, I'm using that as sort of the part of the story where Cedar and I were sort of brooding and breeding up this idea. And it all started something like 12, 13 years ago now, where Cedar, I'd kept bees on and off all my life, and my father had kept bees, but I wouldn't call myself an experienced beekeeper. Yeah, sure, I had bees, but particularly when I was a kid, we didn't have anything like the pests and diseases. We didn't really, we looked at the brood now and then, but we didn't need to really, and we grabbed the honey out and so on. But I didn't have to engage with the husbandry in those days, like you do have to now. And so Cedar ended up keeping 20 or so beehives because his landlord, he was living on an acreage, and his landlord got tax off in Australia for having an agricultural pursuit. And so actually the landlord could pay for the beehives, pay for the gear and pay Cedar and still be in front in terms of tax. So that was great in lots and lots of ways, except for Cedar. For Cedar, he is an energetic person and industrious, but he doesn't like hard work. Do you know what I mean? Hard physical work. And we live in a subtropical climate. It gets really hot and sticky. So Cedar found himself lifting these heavy boxes, as you know, heavy supers of honey onto his ute, up to the, pulling the hives apart and so on, getting stung because the bee suit stuck to him with all the perspiration, all the sweat. And he came home, had dinner, I think, with Michelle and I just one evening and he said, "Dad, there's got to be a better way than this. This is just horrible." He was exhausted. And he said, "We've got to be able to figure out a way to get honey out of a beehive without opening it." And I went, "Whoa." Like, I love, you know, bouncing ideas around with you, but that one seems crazy. I can't imagine how we're going to do that. But to my surprise, he persisted. "No, we can do this," you know. And so we did. Like, I can't resist throwing ideas back and forth with him anyway. Our minds are like that. And so we did start dreaming up all sorts of ideas for how it might work. One of them was, well, what if you had a nichrome, if you know that heating, the sort of wire that you have in your toasters, and you put electric current through it, it warms up. Well, what if we had vertical wires of nichrome down through the wax, and then you heat it up and it forms little tunnels all around the wire because the wax will melt and the honey will fall out. Well, that didn't work. Maybe you could get it to work, but it didn't work for us. We were thinking about whether the comb could pull apart horizontally, because if you could pull it apart somehow like that, then the honey could drop down in between. Wow. It's kind of them on it's a holiday today, isn't it? Yeah, what's happened to holidays? So we did. Cedar carved up fully drawn plastic comb that we could only get from America. So he was getting really persistent with this, and he carved it up with little dentistry type tools so that it could pull apart like that. And then we had to figure out, well, how's it going to get pulled apart? I know we'll use a diaphragm, so we got a old truck tube, you know, and mounted it all, and you could suck on a tube and the truck tube sort of pulled back like a diaphragm can and pull these things apart, and we stuck that in the hive. You know, this is all over months and other ideas and both of us working. It wasn't our main job. And tell me if it's getting too hard to hear once again. And so we did all of that, and the bees did build in the comb and they capped it and so on, and we sucked on the diaphragm, and it wasn't easy to pull apart, but it did, and nothing happened. The honey just stayed in each end of the, as honey does. For those of you know that have had a burr comb stuck in the lid, for example, you can tip it up like that, the honey won't come out. It'll just stay because of, anyway. So that didn't work, and lots of ideas didn't really work, but we kept, Cedar in particular was the one driving this, kept persevering. And he said that one morning, I've had 3 coffees today, so I'm jangly. And I think I'd had that many that morning, and sitting at Cedar's kitchen table, and we had books that we'd been drawing our ideas out in, and I had this other idea and I couldn't quite picture it, which is a bit unusual. Usually Cedar and I can say a few words and throw pictures to each other, if you know what I mean. So I had this idea, could the cells move this way somehow, you know, and I was drawing it out. Maybe I was worrying away at this for half an hour or so, and Cedar looked over and saw what I'd done and said, "Wow, that's it. That's going to work." I went, "Will it? I'm still trying to get it right." And in a way, to his credit, I think he dropped all of these other things that we'd been doing together, and he particularly putting the effort in and said, "No, this one will work." And I guess there's something in that ability to see what might really be you know, give you some sort of yield and be able to drop the other things. And so we started working on that, and I guess it was months before we messed around with 3D printing, and that's very clumsy. It gives you a very rough thing compared to, you know, isn't honeycomb and brood comb such finely made, beautiful stuff? 3D printers won't do that, and you're even pushing it with other forms of injection moulding and so on. Anyway, we finally put that experiment of the cells splitting vertically like that. We put it together and put it in a beehive. We just had a little section this big. It was a bit of an effort to make it, so we mounted in one section of a frame, and we had a window there, and we had a socket wrench reaching in to operate the little mechanism we had. and the beehive there, and we had to wait for them to fill it, and come on, you know. And finally we're at the stage where, wow, it's capped, we can turn that handle. We turned the handle and then just waited. Come on, is something going to happen? And nothing seemed to happen for minutes, hours. It was days no, it wasn't. It was probably just 30 seconds and the honey came out. It was just an extraordinary moment, you know, for both of us after all of that time. But also we had been wondering, of course, looking, what else have other people done? Who else is... There must be other people working on this around the world. It's saying I'm a bit of a drip. There must be other way, you know, people that have worked on this around the world, but we hadn't been able to find anything in our various internet sort of searches. So we saw that honey come out. Maybe for the first time, someone had managed to get honey coming out of a beehive without actually opening the beehive. And it was a really exciting moment. As I've said to others, I wish I had a bit of Italian blood in me. I wish I'd yelled and whooped more, but it was, oh, this is good. No, we were really pleased. And so that's the sort of story of brooding, of birthing this invention. That there's much more that happened. Because it finally ends up like this. So Cedar had the idea of the clear ends. What if we had clear ends rather than... And there was all sorts of crazy stuff that happened. We went with our first rough drawings to an engineer who would draw it up for us, and he knew a little bit about injection moulding, which we didn't know anything about. And he just laughed at this. He said, if you want a mould made for what you're proposing, it'll cost you about $500,000. And like, that was just, what? because we didn't know how to design it to be efficiently, for the moulds to be efficiently made and so on. And in those days, by then we'd been both given up most of our work so that we could focus on this. So we didn't have much money. That's partly why I'm very, very grateful to my dad, who helped us out at that time. He's 90 and was... Sorry, I'm diverting now. My dad is 90. He was going to go walking in Orkney with us just last week, but he ruptured his Achilles ankle, tendon, not ankle, and those plans changed. Anyway, my dad, where were we? Yeah, $500,000 was just, whoa. So, you know, it's just, there were so many things that we had to, little hurdles to overcome in getting to this stage. If you want to, as I'm talking, there's a top cap, I'll take that out, and a bottom cap. And those that haven't met one of these before, that's the tube that plugs into the bottom. And there are sneaky things in this. I just want to describe the sneaky part of this tube. It has a little tongue on it, a little lip, and it looks like it doesn't make sense, and it looks like we've sort of made this badly. If you have a look down that hole, which is where the honey flows and comes out, it looks like we've got everything out of alignment. But actually that gap in there that you'll see as I pass it around, that tongue fits in and locks that in place. But the gap's for more than that. It's for when the honey's flowed out and flowed into your containers, and but there'll always be a little seep, you know, for the next day or so after you've harvested. There'll be the tiny bits of honey just finding its way down there. But you put the cap back in, which was this little thing, but the gap there just allows that last bit of honey to leak back inside the beehive. We call it the honey leak back gap. And so the bees can lick it up, and basically it drains itself and cleans itself. Very, you know, over a day or two. And at the top you'll see there's two slots. This is when I pass it around. The top slot, when this is inserted, will set these frames to have hexagonal cells. You can't see from here, sorry. And the bottom slot, when you put that in and turn it, then you can't see it, but it's turned into vertical channels now. So I'll pass it around so you can play with that. Just one word of warning, this hasn't been in a beehive, so the bees haven't sort of glued it together with their propolis or anything like that. So if you in any way sort of bend it, it'll fly into about 83 pieces, which I don't really mind. We won't have time to put together today or not right now. But, you know, just don't bend it, I guess I'm saying. So, pass that round for whoever wants to play with it.
Do you have to separate the bees from it when you extract or not?
Do you have to separate the bees?
Yeah, like you separate bees from conventional honey sorts, clearables, that sort of stuff.
No, because that's the whole idea, is that the bees can just keep working. And I guess that's another part of the discovery story. We turned that old socket wrench that we had plugged into this sort of makeshift setup, and just pass it to those that haven't. And what we didn't know was, the honey came out, but then what would the bees do? Bertha Bee might have said to Betty Bee, I told you to fill that cell, and you haven't. And Betty Bee would say, I did, I filled it yesterday, and I capped it and everything. No, you didn't, look, it's empty. Let's get out of here, this whole hive's hopeless. There's something wrong with this hive, gives me the creeps. We didn't know what the bees would do. And so we thought, well, maybe they wouldn't notice, maybe they'd abscond because there was something seriously wrong with whatever's going on around here. But it turned out that within a day they chewed back the capping, they repaired the cells that had been fissured by moving like that, and began to fill them again. We couldn't.
You don't trap them when you grind it back the other way and put it back together.
So that was a question about do the bees get trapped? In our early prototypes they did, because we made the walls tight.
It's very easy to do.
But when you're having a look at that, you'll see the walls actually don't meet. So the bees have to really they have to make up the walls with their beeswax, and so if a bee does get trapped, she and her friends can chew herself out. That's the idea of this. You have to look very closely to see that gap, but there is that gap there. Yeah. Yeah, that was a question about, is there a risk of getting wax in the honey itself because when it fissures, of course, it breaks. And that's been a bit of a lovely welcome surprise as well, is that the honey comes out absolutely clean. Sometimes it's important to check that there's the trough down the bottom. Just run your eye down there, and just in case, a moth or something's got in there, but generally nothing can get in there, and it's clean, and the honey comes out remarkably clean. And we've had a look with a dental microscope. I don't know what it's called, but what a dentist can poke into your mouth and look at your teeth. So we've had a close look at these frames. We've found that all of the plastic gets coated with a thin layer of wax, and then they also make up the whole cell. And we've also noticed that when it gets torn, the wax sort of clings together, so flakes don't tend to break off. These are all just lucky things for us. I mean, just fortunate that it works that way. So it's really surprising. The honey seems to come out really, really clean. If I was a commercial producer with these, I think I would still run it through a filter. But for a backyard, amateur producers, we never bother filtering it. It comes out up against the sunlight, lovely and clean. So we can talk some more about that later. I'll keep answering questions, but I'll keep going on with this whole story. So that was the brood, the invention, and so on. The queen excluder. Make sure that the queen stays down the bottom, laying her brood, and doesn't lay brood up in your honey super. Some beekeepers don't like to use them, others are wedded to them. We advise people to use queen excluders, but personally I do sometimes and I don't other times. I like experimenting, and we have made these flow frames. The cell size there is sort of more like a drone, almost a drone cell size. It's not a worker cell size, and it's quite deep, so the queen doesn't like laying in it. She can't reach her thorax all the way down to the bottom, and it's the wrong sort of size too. when we have risked that, sometimes we've had a queen trapped up in the top, and she's laid because she's sort of had to. There's been nothing else. And when a hive goes queenless, I think many of you will know that the workers will start laying drone eggs, and they'll lay in this as well. Anyway, I've sort of lost the thread of where I was going there. But queen excluders are an important part of beekeeping, and beekeepers use them in a variety of ways. But I'm using this. It's sort of like a filter, isn't it? It won't allow the queen through, but it will allow the workers through, and so on. When we had finally done it and overcome a whole lot of the technical challenges, we still knew there were plenty more to go before we were anywhere near producing it. But for me, we were at an ethical sort of a point that I think it's important for innovators and inventors to challenge themselves with, and that is this idea a good idea for the world, for our world? And of course that's a values thing. We're aware that plastic is clogging up our oceans and our landfill. We don't know some of the things it might be doing to our health and so on. We weren't keen on that idea. We also weren't sure what beekeepers would think about it, and whether it was just a distraction from the things that really needed to happen in terms of having a more diverse ecology all around the world for bees, and minimising pesticides and so on. Perhaps it's a sort of a distraction. And so we just had the question, is it a good idea? And we're quite aware of the colony collapse disorder in particularly the United States, and to a certain extent in our own country. And I thought, well, some beekeepers will be able to keep twice as many hives as they have now. So it might increase the number of beehives. So maybe that's a good thing, but I didn't think that was reason enough. And finally, thinking through that, of course I wanted to keep developing this. Cedar and I were on this roll. It was really, really hard to stop. So I had to find some excuse. And my excuse in terms of this ethical questioning of the idea was, well, I think a lot more people will be able to keep bees because of this, and it might encourage a lot of people to keep bees. And for my values, the more beekeepers in the world, the better, because you can't help but start to interact with the natural world and start to realise in a sort of a visceral way how interconnected we all are. And for my values, I think the more people that understand our sense of interdependence and connection with this incredible world that we live in, the better. So that was my excuse to keep going. And so there's a question here.
Yeah, I just want to talk about the materials that you used throughout the trial and error. Obviously now we use plastic
Yeah.
inside a wooden hive itself. Have you looked into sort of a removal from here?
Yeah, so that question's about plastic. I'll answer that one, but I'll lose the plot completely if I answer too many questions. I'll lose the thread. So we'll sort of disintegrate into questions in 10 minutes or so. We have been looking into bioplastics of not only hemp, but there's some wood-based ones, bamboo, and there's even a company trying to pull carbon directly out of the air and make plastic from that, which are, all of those things we want to encourage, and we're actively investigating that. Those plastics aren't ready for us yet. So the ones that we've looked at are too brittle, and so, if anything was jammed in here, you'd turn the key and it would snap. And we had really, it had to be food grade, it had to be the non-gassing and so on. And it also had to have exactly the right amount of flexibility and strength to operate in the way it did. So it was quite a long journey even getting this polypropylene, and we're probably going to change. Or we will be changing our plastic, because this plastic can only handle being irradiated once, and after that it gets more and more brittle. And while you don't do irradiation here, as I understand it, because you don't have the facilities, we irradiate for American foul brood in Australia, and So we burn the brood and send the rest of the hive off to get irradiated and then keep going. That's a whole other story, but this has to be able to handle that. All right, so we decided to keep going. The queen excluder is there, and so the next part of this story is the honey super, which is the flow. For this one, it's the flow super. There they all are, stacked in the super together. You can see the bees working in between, which I didn't know quite what Cedar was getting at when he said clear ends, but it just turns out to be such a marvellous thing to be able to look down the middle, see the bees working between the frames. Like, people have done these side views for a long time. It's sort of a bit of an obvious idea to look at the side, and that is fascinating. But I found that the end view here is like, you can see the bees actually working down the cells, and you can see when they're having a snooze and go, hey, Betty, wake up. And kids can watch their little tongues working and so on. So I'm really pleased with that. That's sort of a spin-off.
It's an observation hive.
Sorry?
It's an observation hive.
It's it becomes partly an observation hive. Yeah, that's true. I mean, observation hives is a whole other subject, but they're wonderful. I really like being able to watch the queen and when all the dances and things go on without actually having to open it. Yeah, so there's the whole super. Now this one is a national size, and you know, in Australia we say UK national, and you just say national because you don't need to say UK. We made the really severe mistake of thinking that Langstroth size hives and supers and so on were common enough here in the UK, and clearly they're not. And not only do we make that mistake, but in Australia we have Langstroth 10s and Langstroth 8s for 10 frames and 8 frames running across. And here, when you say Langstroth, you mean a 10. You don't have 8s. And what did we put on the market with these things? That thing there, it's a Lang 8. It's just ridiculous. It doesn't fit anything here. And I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. And it makes it complicated for you with the brood and all sorts of things.
Question there, because while you're talking, I don't want to disturb you, but we've got one.
I'm very
So I was
disturbed
just
already.
talking
And
about, getting any spares, and it's been really difficult because the queen excluder we provide is a plastic one.
yeah,
I'm trying to get hold of a 8-frame Langstroth queen excluder.
a metal one.
I can help you with that.
All right, okay.
That's wonderful, thank you, because I didn't know what to say. Yeah, and there are just, okay, we'll stay with that queen excluder question. One of the problems with the plastic one is they just pull off sort of slowly, and often you can, you know, upset the bees more in that sort of jerky, slow process of getting it off, and which is one reason why people prefer a metal one, is it's sturdy and lifts off more steadily, even if it is glued on a bit. So I met some beekeepers up in Edinburgh who'd just put a thin strip all the way around the plastic one, and that gave the plastic enough rigidity for them to come off in one piece rather than in that peeling off sort of a way. So they were pleased with that. I prefer the metal ones because of the roundedness too. I don't like the sharp edges of the plastic. But anyway, we do plastic ones, and it's a bit of a thing. I'm using this as a metaphor for what happened to Cedar and me next. We had to, I mean, my dad had been generous in supporting us in